This is a group discussion answering the question, what are cultural futures? The theme of the conference. First, let me explain my view of what cultural futures means to me. Culture is an act of placemaking and identity to me. Let's imagine a wilderness. Some would argue an empty space. I'd suggest not quite empty, but certainly devoid of human action and culture. Now, when humans enter this space, they perceive it, they imbue it with ideas, they enact deeds within the space, which begins to define the very nature of it. This, in itself, is an act of imbuing meaning. Once a space has meaning, it becomes a place in the human mind. Not a space, a place. Humans rarely exist alone. And when groups of humans share these acts of creation, culture emerges. And with every repeated thought, word, action, culture is performed, created, transmitted, transformed. And while not always true, but often, these cultures are linked to space, to place, whether that's a physical landscape or now a digital space. Each place is a palimpsest of meaning, layer upon layer of information, tangible and physical, social, emotional, economic, political, and across time it becomes a landscape of memory, as stories of the past and the present are embedded within it. For me, this is an act of creating culture, creating a sense of our place in the world, whether physical or conceptual. Now, culture is not static. It evolves when we engage with it. It's everywhere around us. It's shaped by the past, and it's shaped by how we think about the past in the present, and how we make that part of our own identities. And this identity is the agency and power that manifests itself as we move through the world every day, creating and recreating culture. Everything we think, say and do is influenced by the cultures we come from. Not just where we come from or our heritage, but all of the folk groups we're involved in shaped us. We're the sum of all of the ideas we have and the stories we hold dear that guide our identity and our morality. So if this is the link between the past and how it informs the present, surely we can look at the cultures we are creating today and see the futures we're building, with every foundation stone we are laying right now, today. Cultural futures to me are about how we consciously reflect on these things that affect our thoughts, words and deeds in the now, and use that to choose how we shape the futures we create. Another aspect of this is the question, who gets to shape the future of our cultures and our cultural spaces? Who chooses what's preserved? Who defines the values promoted in our cultural spaces? These are really vital questions, and this is what I hope we can talk about during this session, and all the questions that arise from that. The format of this session is a workshop, and the concept is I'll pose questions to focus us all on a topic that we can explore together, where we all offer our ideas, our expertise, our perspective. It's about participation and co-creation. In practical terms, I'll share a collaborative board on the screen using a tool called Miro. We'll move through each section of the board, and I'll read out the topic for each board and a few questions. I have some examples of answers there too. I'd love it if people could shout out their answers, ideas and comments, or type them in the chat box. And if somebody else could shout them out, that would really help me, because I only have one screen in front of me. I'll write all of these answers, ideas and comments down on the board. And by the end of the session, we'll have crowdsourced a lot of information, a lot of answers. And if not, we will certainly have raised a lot of questions that we can all take away and reflect on. So I do hope you'll get on board and join in, as this workshop won't work without input from you.
Uncertainty in the present about the future does seem to make a lot of people cling more closely to the imagined traditions of an ancient past that's full of wisdom. Yeah, I just see that as part and parcel of uncertain times, really.
Definitely. Yeah, and that is a huge thing that we often hear, isn't it? You know, people want to revive that idyllic past, you know, what we were talking about this morning. And it is often an imagined past, and it seems rosy, doesn't it? You know, when we were all at one with nature, and, you know, and coming from a background in archaeology, I can't think of anything worse than living back who knows when. Life was so hard, but here we are with all these imagined versions of past. And realistically, there are multiple versions of past as well, aren't there? Like, everyone has a different view of the past, and whose view is being put at the forefront of that within these cultural spaces. That's a huge thing.
I think we can add to that as well, just in that as we become more mindful of these things, is that, you know, in the present we can create what we want for the future.
Absolutely. I'm going to write that
down. Can I say something? Can anyone hear me?
Yeah, sure.
Just briefly, I've been thinking cultural futures because I've been thinking of the phrase cultural sustainability a lot. And what I don't like, or the problem I have with that, is sustaining some, you know, sustainability. A lot of aspects of the present are not things that I would want to sustain at all. And what I really like about cultural futures is that it's a way of thinking about where we are here now, but there's a more utopian and hopeful element here, and I've really enjoyed experiencing that in this space.
That's fantastic. That's actually really nice to hear, because that's one of the functions I hoped for the space. You know, it's a place for imagining. I mean, we've heard a lot of quite awful things this morning from yourself, Matt, and thank you for speaking to those things. And also with what Andrew was talking about. So I think right now, there doesn't seem like there's a lot of hope in the world. And I think it's really quite important that we get involved in having those conversations about hope. How can we transform our cultural spaces, our cultural projects, to make them less depressing? Because I think a lot of people are feeling like a lot of this space is quite depressing at the moment, and it is nice just to be able to imagine something different. But we do need to work from the base that we were exploring this morning, where there are problems, because there's no point in just being utopian about it unless we are literally going to face the problems as well. So I think it's really great that we can have that conversation this morning and then contrast it with potentially something hopeful. We have a few comments in the chat. Digital cultures can feel beyond geographical borders, but we need to be mindful of censorship. So I'm just going to write that on the board. I have to switch screens when I'm reading the chat. I'd be keen to know more about what you mean there with censorship specifically. I'm just going to check if there's something else there in the chat. The China is not the same as in the UK. Absolutely. Yeah, totally. And yeah, that does add a really great point. The complexity of globalization and the different expectations. We have more. Superstition Sam, to me, cultural futures means that we, in the present, will be leaving something of ourselves for future generations. If right now we simply focus on copying and pasting the past, it means that in 10 or 20 years' time or more, the age we are living in now will have nothing to contribute to history or culture. Perhaps that's why we used to clearly define decades like the 80s or 90s, but now everything just seems like blended together. For instance, who still feels like it's 2019? Raise your hand. I certainly do. I'm going to type that, so I'm not going to raise my hand. But yeah, I absolutely do. It doesn't feel that different. I hope that sums up your intent there. Paul Cardell responding to Helen. One thing we found really helpful in the Folklore Without Borders network is the idea of recentering, not including people as new margins, but shifting the centre to reflect broader actual participation. Yeah.
Can I say a couple of things about that? I mean, Sam's last one about the question of copy pasting the past, and I think one of the things that happens there is that it's less copy pasting; it's more copy pasting a deliberately extracted version of an idealized past, as other people said. I mean, it's like religious fundamentalists. There's an argument that goes, oh, religious fundamentalists just read stuff literally. No. They're very, very selective about what they read in order to construct a model. So I think this, and the point that I was kind of making there in response to Helen, and I think it also gets to, I mean, it's also thinking about something that we haven't got to yet in the chat that Steve raises about the internet. One of the things for cultural futures, I think, is that it requires an actual system, an actual proper addressing of a cultural present. Because I think construction of a cultural present at the moment is itself highly selective. You know, certainly for us in folklore, there are lots and lots of people working on folklore and working in folklore who are not all recognized within that mainstream. And the point I was making there in response to Helen is we don't make folklore inclusive by magnanimously saying, well, you know, right, we'll admit that you're doing folklore, there you are at the margins. We start with saying, look, you are doing this, we are doing this, those people are doing that. All of those things have a weight. And so if we are drawing a circle of participation to include all of those things. It's not pushing those other people out to the margins or leaving them there. It's finding a new centre that incorporates us all on a different equitable basis.
Yeah, this is an idea that's been developing recently, isn't it? I remember speaking to you about this at the last meeting. I find that a fascinating concept, and I have been thinking about that because you were saying before, it's instead of EDI or DEI as a focus, because it seems a more positive way to move forward. And I have been considering, is that a starting point? Because I will say, I was going to put this in a little bit of a talk, but it seemed controversial. So I'll speak about it in a more general context here. Tokenism. There's a lot of tokenism potential with these things. And putting this conference together, tokenism came into things. I wanted to get speakers and panelists from very diverse backgrounds and experiences and identities. Obviously, it's about inclusion. And there were massive gaps in the people that I could find within my network who are working with engagement in an academic sense. And then I thought, well, let me search and see who's actually doing this work. I found a few projects directly trying to engage racial minority groups, and most of them were run by middle class white men. And I say middle class because they're working in academia and they're going out to groups and engaging them. And I thought, well, that's not really what I'm looking for. I'm looking for people who have lived experience of this thing, doing it, working in engagement as a specialism. I didn't want tokenistic people or people to feel like they were being treated like they were a token. And it was impossible. It was impossible for me to find a UK practitioner. Now, I might not have found them, but the fact that that's so hard, I do think the recentering concept is a very good starting point, because I think trying to move too far, too quickly, we're at risk of making a lot of mistakes because we're guessing about what's going to work and what's going to happen. And I think you're right, and we need to bring it in a bit more. And this is why I wanted to have these crowdsourced ideas, because it's not about a top-down approach. It's about people getting together from all of these different perspectives and saying, well, how are you doing it in your work? Or what are you doing in your community? How do you feel personally? And just hear what people are saying and hear the different perspectives in the room. Because it's all very well to just choose an approach to doing this kind of work, but it can very easily be wrong, and we'll only know that later.
If it's okay, I was just typing something, but I kind of like got lost in the line of logic. And I'm just wondering about this idea of including voices in the centre. And I don't know if I could find a cultural centre. I know I'm not part of a cultural centre. When people consume culture, do any of us have any influence over how people consume culture? If we ever would have done in the past, I think, and I don't want to make assumptions about the age range of most people in this room, but I'd imagine there were a few of us who grew up with the idea of a selective tradition in culture, like the are experts and critics who are able to regulate the canon of what counts as high culture or whatever. And potentially, if you are as ancient as I am, you grew up with like 4 or 5 television channels and that was it. And so it's really easy then to understand the cultural centre, to even feel part of the cultural centre. But when I look at young people today, my own kids, they are consuming culture in ways that completely avoid any kind of cultural centre, any kind of selective tradition. And I think this isn't to disagree with what's been said or the intent behind what anybody said at all. But I think it's just a kind of a reflection on, do we get to do we get to organise who gets into the centre when we are very much on a margin? And I think this is where I was struggling to put it in a coherent way in prose, in written prose. I think what I'm looking at is the who listens to us. This is the question I'm asking. I would love to think lots and lots of people listen to us and we can exert huge influence. And I think through practice, through what we do, through inclusivity, through opening up spaces for emergent cultural traditions within folklore is absolutely vital. So, but I'm just, when people are talking about the centre, I'm confused, I think, about what we mean here by the centre, because are we actually part of the centre? Is there a centre anymore? And is this part of what Cultural Futures is maybe part of that process, is thinking about how to do culture in a massively dispersed series of cultural spaces? How do we reach out across outside of our little bubble world into others, into making those connections? And yeah, absolutely, as Caroline said, keep the EDL on the margins. But from my own work, I know that loads of recruitment into the far right comes from targeting damaged, lonely people who are lost, who haven't got any sense of a centre in their lives. And that's what the far right tends to offer, is centeredness, is coherence, roots, to use the word that we used before. So maybe, I don't know, I think what I'm edging towards is suggesting that it's being more active in reaching beyond, I guess, those traditional ways of doing what we do, and thinking about how do you reach out and make that attractive offer to somebody who is looking for meaning, looking for some structure, in a way that reaches them. And that means perhaps going outside of that space that we are centering, and thinking about, well, where are the audiences at? Where are the people that we want to connect with, that we want to dissuade from other choices? Sorry, I'm rambling. I will stop.
I think that's a fabulous point, and I think two things. I'm just going to jump in and quickly say, I think I've been wrangling with this. So I think the concept that Paul and Matt are bringing about recentering is potentially less about finding a new centre and more about moving towards the margins, moving the establishment more towards the margins. Have I got that right or wrong, Paul and Matt?
It's more like a difference between median and mean. So you're actually trying to reflect participation on an equal basis, rather than trying to, I don't know, reorient the priorities, trying to disable the priorities exist, might be a better.
Right, so it's more about the priorities. Yeah, okay. The other thing you're talking about there, Andrew, I think is really interesting, because there's this whole move towards decentralization in the world. We see it in the technological world. There's a whole concept of decentralizing the power of the internet, and we have things like Web3 and even Web4, and that's what we're doing here now. Instead, we could have gone to London, and how many voices would we not have? How many people giving their opinion would we not have in this room? I looked at London train tickets the other day, and it was £300 to go to an event. I wouldn't be here. People from America, Brazil, they wouldn't be here. We wouldn't get to hear what they're saying today. So, I do think there's a whole cultural progression towards decentralization, and it will be interesting now to take those two ideas that we've got there, where it's about recentering versus the possibility of total decentralization and what that would mean in practice. I am aware that we are running out of time again. I will say Steve has put in the chat, we now have a massive shared cultural space, the internet, and that whether we like it or not, it's become the battleground for different ideologies. Some are expressly competing to dominate the landscape, and others are engaging more benignly. And it seems the more directed engagement is gaining ground. And that raises a really good point, and I will type this in a second. That raises a really good point about power and privilege. I mean, obviously, this is a huge part of this conversation, and this space and time now is not enough time to talk about this. So I hope there will be another opportunity. The privileged voices have always led these conversations. And while we're all saying, this is a great space and we're all coming together, there is still a huge level of privilege with accessing online. You have to have the tech to do it. Someone said to me today, they couldn't get into the space because their computer kept crashing. And that's really sad. They wanted to be here. That needs addressing. But also, it's not just about, do you have the tech? Do you live in a rural community without Wi-Fi? I'm in Devon in the UK, and I'm normally in a city. And this is the first time I've experienced bad Wi-Fi for a decade. And I'm absolutely shocked, because this is apparently normal. People can't do these events with this kind of internet. But even more than that, people are not necessarily initiated into the culture of the internet and the behaviours of the internet. Do you remember when we all started first using social media? There are rules and we didn't know them. And I know the number of faux pas I made just getting to know Twitter. And then you look back and you realise that that's not the culture. And you're ostracised because of that. You're not behaving right. You're not in the room because your behaviours online are not correct. And that's a very privileged place to be, where you know how to behave online. You know how to access certain spaces. You know what a hashtag means. So yeah, that's really a really good point. The internet is now a battleground, and the fight is right there, and not everyone's in that battle. So I will say there were loads of comments. There were really good comments, and I just feel like there's not been enough time for any of these conversations today. I made a board. We've got a few ideas on that board, and there are many blank spaces to be filled in. this morning. We could have carried on for hours talking about those things. I do feel like these are conversations we need to have. And I'm really glad everyone's come here today to have these conversations. Who decides what should be included in a global cultural future? Exactly. Miss Raccoon, exactly. How do we ensure that we celebrate, not appropriate the law of other communities? That is a huge topic, and that needs discussing too. Paul, that was you and Kath. More intergenerational conversations. Absolutely. How do children and young people envisage their cultural futures? How do we support that? Culture is dominated by simplistic narratives. It's difficult for anything more complicated to replace those narratives. Foreigners taking your stuff still doesn't have much of a counter-narrative, and that's the sort of thing a more equitable cultural future is up against. Against that, recentering is meaningless. There could be a whole session just on that. Absolutely important to talk about that. Some of us live here all the time. Mark, I don't know how you do what you do in Devon. It's amazing. Right, okay, so we're really out of time now. The impact of bot farms on social media. Are they part of culture? These conversations are amazing. I'm going to add all of these to the board, right? So I'm going to take a copy of this board and send it to anyone who wants it. So if you want to be included in an email to get all the slides, send me an email or send me a message on Eventbrite. Right, I'm going to end that there because we're going to be back in around 10 minutes for a panel Q&A, okay? So everyone nip and put the kettle on or whatever you need to do.